6 hours later, Pintel was standing on a beach in his own clothes with a long, sharpened stick in his hands. He squinted down at the incoming sea wave for signs of life. It was getting harder to see anything in the growing darkness, but he was the last person who'd ever admit to wasting a whole evening on anything, let alone on something a brain-dead pelican could pull off in one try. As soon as he spied a flicker of motion beneath the water's surface, he snarled and stabbed at it. All he got was a pathetic little splash and a bark of excitement from the prison dog behind him. "Give it up, Pin," Ragetti droned from the same direction. "All the good fish have probably gone to sleep for the night." Pintel whirled around in a fury.
"Oi, did I give it up the first time Poochie there wouldn't eat me rations in jail?"
"No, but you did go a full week without a half-decent meal 'cause of it." Pintel had to lift a hand to shield his eyes from their campfire. Rags and the dog were lounging on opposite sides of the blaze, each gnawing on one of the stale bread rolls their trio had made off with from the fort. The canvas bundle, with all their other stolen items, lay open by Ragetti's side. His gangly comrade motioned to their inventory. "We've already got food. Come grab a piece and sit with us." It almost sounded like pity to Pintel. That didn't help his aggravation.
"I've had enough Navy bread,"
he groused.
"This'll be me first meal as a free, uncursed man, and I wants it to be something worth the wait. And I've been craving a roasted piece of fish for 10 years.
Ragetti nodded towards the dog. "How about roasting him? With all those rolls you fed him this week, he's probably got his own bread stuffing built in."
"Not on your life,"
Pintel said with mostly feigned outrage.
"He's a free man same as us now, ain't you, boy?"
The dog made an agreeable-sounding bark. Ragetti scoffed. Pintel stole a final peek at his cohort while turning back to the waves. He saw one of those knobby hands reach down and unfurl a corner of the canvas, exposing, of course, that stinking Bible. Ragetti never touched it, though. He simply sat there and thought, still gripping the edge of the canvas. Then he tossed it back over the book with what looked like disgust. For some reason, that threw off Pintel even more. What was wrong with Rags? They'd escaped. Their curse was lifted. They didn't even have Captain Barbossa or the rest of his nasty crew looming over them anymore. Sure, they weren't rich like they'd expected to be by now, but they had a chance to fix that. They had a second chance at everything now. Why couldn't that little ingrate just be happy already? Pintel's stomach growled. He fumed at the water, and just like that, his last thread of patience snapped. The sea rat lunged into the surf with an angry roar and started stabbing his spear at anything that moved. Fish, seaweed, bubbles. He didn't care what any of it was. He just wanted to take his frustration out on something that wasn't going to make him regret it. A thump behind him made him halt. Forgetting his temper, Pintel turned and blinked at the sand. A round green pod the size of a cannonball lay there now. "How about that for a first meal?" Ragetti's voice called from above. Pintel looked up and nearly toppled into the water.
"What are you doing up there?"
Ragetti smirked from the top of the nearest tree. His green waistcoat and spindly limbs almost made him look like another palm leaf in the dark. "Picking coconuts," he answered. "The green ones are supposed to be good for drinking and eating." Pintel nodded nervously and waded back to shore. That at least was more like the Rags he knew.
"Well, climb down and we'll find out."
Ragetti cut another coconut loose with his knife and tossed it onto the beach. He sheathed the knife, unwound his legs from the tree trunk, and dangled by his arms for a second before dropping harmlessly onto the sand as well. In minutes, he had the tops of both pods sawed off to expose the sweet-smelling liquid inside. Pintel raised his coconut like a rum tankard.
"To freedom?"
Ragetti repeated the gesture with less conviction. "To freedom." They clunked their drinks together and chugged them straight down. It wasn't rum, but after a week of dingy prison water, this beverage tasted good enough to almost bring tears to Pintel's eyes. Ragetti also seemed pleasantly surprised. Then it came time to try the coconut pulp. Both men took a bite and chewed. They stopped in unison and traded shifty glances. Pintel swallowed his mouthful, hoping it would make things better. It didn't. He knew nothing about the growth stages of coconuts. He just knew that whatever stage this one was in made it taste and feel like eating a wet piece of chalk. Ragetti swallowed his bite too, probably not to be outdone by Pintel. The sour expressions they both cast onto their coconuts after that said everything. Pintel was picking his brain for a helpful remark when another flicker of motion caught his eye. It wasn't in the water this time, but on the beach. He turned to it and froze when he saw a small, pale crab creeping lazily along the tide's edge. The crab made it another foot, then burst apart with a loud bang. Pintel blew the smoke from his pistol and trudged past a flabbergasted Ragetti.
There's dinner.
The first time they'd escaped from the Navy, it had taken Rags a week to come around. Pintel still remembered the moment when he'd seen it. They had jumped ship just north of Cuba and spent most of that week rowing from one port to another along the island's coast on their way to Tortuga. There had been one night where they were forced to rough it on an uninhabited beach, and the next morning, the older man had woken to a sound he hadn't heard from his nephew in a year. Laughter. He'd found Ragetti down by the water, lying on his back and waving his arms and legs against the ground to make a sand angel. Pintel had never been a high-ranking pirate, but every time he recalled that moment, he felt like the king of the Brethren court. It had been a short-lived victory. Pintel had known from the start what deserting the service would mean for the two of them and Kingston, and when Ragetti had finally asked him when they'd be going home, there had been nothing to do but tell him the truth. Rags had never quite been Rags again after that. He'd still been happy a lot of the time, even after he'd lost his right eye, even during those 10 years with their Aztec curse. But there'd been something different about him. Something less aware, less inclined to speak or engage his surroundings the way a man his age normally would. Something less human. There'd been times, especially during their curse, when Pintel had felt more like he had an attack hound than a friend by his side. Maybe that was how the older escapee had gotten the prison dog to warm up to him. He knew a thing or two about how a pooch's mind worked. If only he had half a clue of how Ragetti's mind worked now. There weren't any sand angels the morning after the coconut mishap. Just a lot of packing up to do. The pair made short work of that, even throwing in a few more coconuts that Pintel convinced Ragetti to pick for drinking water. Then they set about dousing the last of their campfire. They were using their naval hats to pour seawater over the final embers when the dog scampered up to them with a very pressing matter. Pintel sighed when he heard the clink of those keys dropping at his feet.
Not right now, Poochie, he said. We're busy.
The dog barked and wagged its tail.
Fine.
Pintel grabbed the keys and cast them aside. Seconds later, the dog returned and happily dropped them at his feet again. Pintel tossed them farther this time, only to get the same results. He certainly had taught the little job lover how to have fun. Pintel eyed the fire's sooty remains, determining that it really was out. Then he picked up the keys with a grin.
All right, fetch!
He turned and threw them along the beach. Crusty old scalawag as he was, he had to laugh as he watched his hairy playmate tear off after them with its tongue flapping in the breeze. He even stumbled after the canine to meet it partway when it came running back for another round. 2 throws later, Pintel was outright cackling with glee.
That's a good boy, Poochie,
he crowed as he bent to ruffle the dog's ears. He took the keys again and pointed into the distance.
Out that way. Go!
The dog took off across the sand, knowing the routine by now and wanting a head start. Pintel stood up, aimed his next throw, and lobbed the keys after their keeper. Ragetti dove in from his left and snatched them out of the air. Pintel dropped his grin and paused. The dog stopped running and looked back at Ragetti too. Neither of them seemed to know what the taller figure's next move would be. Ragetti faced the dog and held up the keys. Just like Pintel in the fort, he waved them around a few times to make sure the animal's eyes were on them. It might have been a heartwarming sight if it weren't for his stiff, upright stance, or his unnerving silence, or Poochie's suddenly less playful demeanor. At long last, Ragetti turned with lightning speed and hurled the keys away, into the trees along the top of the shore.
Oi!
Pintel shouted. The dog went charging up the dunes and out of sight. Ragetti didn't budge. There was nothing for Pintel to do but haul himself up that sandy slope after their 4-legged companion. He found Poochie reared up and scratching at the trunk of a palm tree. The keys hung by their ring from a jutting strip of bark 3 feet above the poor thing's nose. Pintel reached them with ease and handed them back to their rightful holder. That was when he heard Ragetti storming up the dunes behind him. He sent the youngster a puncturing glare.
What the blazes is wrong with you?
Ragetti stopped short as if he'd really been punctured. Then his snark caught up to him. What, won't we playin' fetch no more?
All right, that's it. What do you have against the dog, Rags? You think he was sitting there with those keys in jail just to taunt you?
Why do you like him so much? You've only known him for a week. And guess what, Pin? He ain't yours. Pintel shrugged snidely.
Well, he must not have liked his real owners too much if he decided to tag along with me.
Ragetti's harsh expression slackened at that. He seemed to be turning something over in his head, but Pintel couldn't begin to guess what. The one-eyed fellow straightened up then with a bitter little huff. Fine, he muttered. Don't let me cramp your style. He turned and skulked away.
What's that supposed to mean?
Pintel demanded. Nothing. The elder went stomping after him.
Don't you walk away from...
The ground collapsed under Pintel's feet with a sickening crunch.
Pinners!
Ragetti's voice cried. The bald man plunged into darkness. He didn't fall far, maybe 7 feet, but he landed hard on his back in a deluge of sand and broken wood planks. He gaped up in shock at the sunlit hole above him for a second before he started coughing and groaning. Ragetti and the dog both appeared on all fours at the edges of the hole.
Pintel!
The obvious one of the two shouted down. Are you all right?
Great,
the fallen man rasped.
Never better.
He managed to sit up among the debris after a minute. By then, Ragetti was down in the strange pit with him and trying to help him to his feet. A long rope, something else they'd salvaged from Port Royal, dangled in the light beside the younger pirate. Pintel stood and looked around in a daze.
What is this place?
Looks like an old storehouse, Ragetti observed. Pintel squinted into the shadows. Sure enough, he discovered a row of wooden racks standing just a few steps away from him. Various bottles and jugs of brown liquid lined each one. He moved closer and picked a bottle from the shelves. Then he pulled out the stopper and sniffed its contents. His eyes practically sparked.
It's rum. It all must be.
Rum runners, Ragetti mused.
What?
People who sells and trades the stuff. There's caches like this hidden all over the Caribbean. Ragetti frowned up at the hole in the ceiling. Must have forgot about this one if they ain't been maintaining it. Another wooden structure suddenly took shape in the darkness to Pintel's right. He lurched over to that next, still sore from his tumble, and found it to be a wooden staircase. He scaled the first few steps, felt around on the low ceiling, and pushed open the storehouse's proper entrance. More sunlight poured into the room, revealing shelves of rum in every direction. Pintel eyed the hoard ravenously. Then the former businessman got another idea.
How much of this you think we can load into the boat?
He asked. You'll go blinder than a starfish if you tries drinking all this, Ragetti retorted. Pintel donned a conniving smile.
Who said anything about drinking it?